For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as one of the most stable and deeply integrated partnerships in the world. But recently, rising tensions over trade policies have sparked serious debate among economists, policymakers, and global observers. What happens when two of the world's closest economic partners begin to drift apart? And more importantly, who actually pays the price? In this video, we break down the facts, the economic realities, and the potential consequences of the latest U.S.-Canada trade tensions, without the noise, without the exaggeration. To understand what's happening today, we need to step back and take a closer look at just how deeply connected the economies of the United States and Canada really are. This is not a typical international relationship. It's not just about exporting goods from one country to another. What exists between these two nations is something far more complex, a highly integrated economic system that has evolved over decades. In many ways, the United States and Canada function less like separate economies and more like a single, interconnected network. Businesses on both sides of the border rely on each other at nearly every stage of production, from raw materials to finished products. One of the clearest examples of this integration can be seen in the automotive industry. When a car is manufactured in North America, it is rarely built entirely in one place. Instead, different components are produced in multiple locations across both countries. A part might be designed in one region, manufactured in another, assembled somewhere else, and then shipped back across the border again for final integration. In fact, it's not uncommon for certain auto parts to cross the U.S.-Canada border several times before a vehicle is fully completed. Each crossing represents another layer of cooperation between factories, workers, and supply chains in both countries. This system has been built for efficiency. It allows companies to reduce costs, specialize production, and maintain a steady flow of goods. But it also creates a high level of dependency, because when systems are this tightly connected, even a small disruption can have widespread consequences. If there are delays at the border, changes in trade policies, or increases in costs at any stage of the process, those effects don't stay contained. They ripple outward, impacting production timelines, pricing, and ultimately consumers. And it's not just the automotive sector. Energy systems, agriculture, manufacturing, and even retail supply chains are all linked in similar ways. Electricity generated in one country can power homes in another. Agricultural products move back and forth depending on seasonal demand. Raw materials are processed in one location and refined in another. This level of integration didn't happen overnight. It is the result of decades of cooperation, trade agreements, and shared economic interests. The key takeaway here is simple but important. The United States and Canada are not just neighbors trading goods across a border. They are partners operating within a shared economic ecosystem. And in a system like that, when pressure is applied in one area, whether through policy changes, tariffs, or disruptions, the effects don't stay isolated. They spread. Understanding this interconnected foundation is essential to understanding why even small shifts in policy or tone can have consequences that reach far beyond what most people expect. Let's simplify one of the most misunderstood concepts in global economics: tariffs. At its core, a tariff is a tax placed on goods that are imported from another country. Governments use tariffs as a policy tool, often with the goal of protecting domestic industries or responding to trade imbalances. On paper, it sounds straightforward: make foreign goods more expensive so locally produced goods become more competitive. But the reality of how tariffs actually work is often very different from how they are commonly described. Here's the key detail that many people miss. A tariff is not paid by the exporting country. It's not a direct charge to a foreign government or manufacturer. Instead, the tariff is paid by the domestic company that is importing those goods into the country. For example, if a U.S.-based company imports steel from Canada and a tariff is applied, that American company is responsible for paying the additional cost at the border. That cost doesn't just disappear. Businesses have to account for it. And in most cases, they do so in one of three ways. First, they may pass the cost on to consumers by increasing prices. This is the most common outcome, especially in industries where demand remains strong. Second, companies might absorb some of the costs themselves, which can reduce profit margins and potentially impact wages, hiring, or investment decisions. Third, they may attempt to shift their supply chains to alternative sources, which can take time, increase complexity, and sometimes lead to even higher costs. So while tariffs are often presented as a way to target foreign competitors, the immediate financial impact is usually felt within the country that imposes them. That's why some economists describe tariffs as a kind of indirect consumption tax, because ultimately they can raise the cost of everyday goods, from vehicles and appliances to food and fuel. Now, to be clear, tariffs can serve strategic purposes. Governments may use them to protect emerging industries, respond to unfair trade practices, or strengthen domestic production in critical sectors. But in highly interconnected economies, like that of the United States and Canada, the effects can be more complicated. When supply chains cross borders multiple times, a single tariff can be applied repeatedly at different stages of production. That means the final cost of a product can increase far beyond the initial tax rate. For businesses, this creates uncertainty. For consumers, it often translates into higher prices. And for the broader economy, it can slow down trade flows that were previously efficient and stable. The key takeaway is this: tariffs are not just a tool of international pressure, they are also a domestic economic decision with real consequences at home. Understanding how they function is essential to understanding why even a single policy change can have ripple effects across industries, markets, and everyday life. In recent months, discussions around potential increases in tariffs on Canadian goods have drawn significant attention from economists, policymakers, and industry leaders. These proposals are often framed as part of a broader shift in economic strategy, one that prioritizes domestic production and aims to reduce reliance on foreign imports. Supporters of these measures argue that tariffs can serve as a powerful tool to strengthen the national economy. From their perspective, increasing tariffs can help protect domestic industries from foreign competition. By making imported goods more expensive, locally produced alternatives may become more attractive, potentially boosting demand for domestic manufacturers. There is also the argument of reducing trade imbalances. When a country imports more than it exports, tariffs are sometimes seen as a way to level the playing field by discouraging excessive imports and encouraging local production. In addition, some policymakers view tariffs as a way to reinforce economic independence, especially in critical sectors such as energy, manufacturing, and raw materials. The idea is to ensure that key industries remain resilient and less vulnerable to external disruptions. On the surface, these goals can sound both practical and strategic. However, critics caution that the situation is far more complex, particularly when dealing with economies that are deeply interconnected, like those of the United States and Canada. Unlike relationships where trade flows are more one-directional, the U.S.-Canada economic system is highly integrated. Goods, services, and resources move back and forth across the border in a continuous cycle. This means that policies designed to protect one part of the economy can unintentionally affect others. For example, a tariff on imported materials might benefit certain domestic producers, but at the same time, it could increase costs for manufacturers who rely on those same materials as inputs. Those higher costs can then move through the supply chain, affecting production, pricing, and competitiveness. This is what economists refer to as a ripple effect. When pressure is applied in one area of a connected system, the impact doesn't stay contained. It spreads across industries, regions, and even borders. Businesses may be forced to adjust quickly, sometimes by raising prices, sometimes by restructuring supply chains, and sometimes by delaying investments altogether due to uncertainty. Another important factor is timing. Supply chains are not easily or quickly replaced. Even if companies want to shift away from imported goods, building new domestic capacity can take years, not months. In the short term, this creates a gap where costs rise before alternatives are fully available. That gap is often where the economic strain is most visible. It's also why many analysts emphasize the importance of balance when it comes to trade policy. Tariffs can be effective in certain contexts, particularly when used in a targeted and strategic way. But when applied broadly within a highly integrated system, their effects can become difficult to control. The key takeaway from this policy shift is not simply whether tariffs are good or bad. It's that in a deeply connected economic relationship, every action has multiple reactions. And understanding those reactions is essential to evaluating the true impact of any policy decision. Now that we understand how tariffs work and why policy shifts matter, the next question is simple. Where do these effects actually show up in the real world? Because economic policy doesn't stay on paper. It moves into factories, markets, and everyday life. Let's break it down into three key areas where the impact is often most visible. 1. Manufacturing. Manufacturing is one of the first sectors to feel the pressure when trade conditions change. As we discussed earlier, many industries, especially automotive and heavy machinery, rely on cross-border supply chains between the United States and Canada. Components are sourced, processed, and assembled across multiple locations, often crossing the border several times before a final product is completed. When tariffs are introduced or increased, each of those crossings can become more expensive. That means the cost of production rises, sometimes significantly. For manufacturers, this creates a difficult choice. Absorb the higher costs and reduce profit margins, pass the costs on to consumers, or attempt to restructure supply chains, which can be slow and costly. In many cases, companies end up doing a combination of all three. The result is often higher prices, tighter margins, and increased uncertainty within the industry. 2. Energy. Energy is another critical area where changes in trade conditions can have a major impact. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of energy resources to the United States, including oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power. This relationship has been built over decades and plays a key role in maintaining a stable and reliable energy supply. When trade policies shift, whether through tariffs, regulations, or political tension, it can influence both pricing and availability. Even small disruptions in energy trade can have broader effects because energy is a foundational input for nearly every sector of the economy. Higher energy costs can increase expenses for transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and even household utilities. This means the impact is not limited to one industry. It spreads across the entire economic system. 3. Consumer goods. Finally, we come to the area most people notice first: consumer goods. When import costs rise due to tariffs, those costs are often passed along through the supply chain until they reach the final buyer. This can affect a wide range of everyday products, including vehicles, electronics, groceries, household items. Even if the price increase on a single product seems small, the cumulative effect across multiple categories can become significant over time. For households, this translates into higher living costs. For businesses, it can mean reduced demand if consumers begin to cut back on spending. Free trend. The bigger picture. What connects all three of these areas, manufacturing, energy, and consumer goods, is the idea that economic policies have layered effects. A decision made at the policy level can move through supply chains, industries, and markets before eventually reaching individuals. And in a highly interconnected system like that of the United States and Canada, those effects rarely stay isolated. They build, overlap, and influence each other in ways that are not always immediately visible, but become increasingly clear over time. That's why understanding real-world impact is essential. Because ultimately, the true cost of any economic shift is not just measured in trade data, but in how it shapes industries, prices, and everyday life. One of the most overlooked, yet highly sensitive, aspects of the U.S.-Canada economic relationship is what happens at the local level, particularly in communities located near the border. While national trade figures often dominate headlines, the real, immediate impact of policy changes is often felt most strongly in these regional economies. Border communities operate in a unique environment. For decades, cities and towns along the U.S.-Canada border have developed economic models that rely heavily on cross-border movement. This includes not just large-scale trade, but everyday activities that many people take for granted. Let's break this down into three key areas. 1. Shopping. Retail activity is a major driver of economic life in border regions. Consumers frequently cross the border to take advantage of price differences, product availability, or currency exchange rates. For example, shoppers may travel for lower fuel prices, discounted retail goods, bulk purchases from large stores. This consistent flow of customers supports local businesses, shopping centers, and retail workers. However, when trade tensions rise or policies change, even slightly, consumer behavior can shift quickly. If crossing the border becomes more expensive, less convenient, or politically sensitive, fewer people make the trip. And when that flow slows down, local businesses feel it almost immediately. 2. Tourism. Tourism. Tourism is another critical component of border economies. Many regions depend on short-term visitors from across the border for weekend trips, seasonal travel, events and festivals. Hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, and transportation services all benefit from this steady stream of visitors. But tourism is highly sensitive to perception. It's not just about formal restrictions, it's also about how people feel. Changes in political tone, uncertainty around policies, or concerns about costs can discourage travel, even if borders technically remain open. A slight drop in visitor numbers can lead to noticeable declines in revenue, especially for small and medium-sized businesses that rely on consistent foot traffic. 3. Small business trade. Beyond shopping and tourism, many small businesses operate across the border in more direct ways. Local suppliers, service providers, and independent traders often rely on cross-border relationships to sustain their operations. These businesses may source materials from across the border, sell products to nearby international customers, provide services that depend on cross-border mobility. When policies shift or economic conditions change, these smaller operations often have fewer resources to adapt quickly. Unlike large corporations, they may not have the flexibility to restructure supply chains or absorb increased costs. As a result, they can be among the first to experience financial pressure. The sensitivity of border economies. What makes border economies particularly important is how quickly they respond to change. Unlike national trends, which can take time to develop, local economies react almost in real time. Even small shifts in policy, pricing, or public sentiment can lead to noticeable economic changes within weeks or even days. This makes border regions an early indicator of broader economic trends. The bigger perspective, understanding border economies adds an important layer to the overall picture. It shows that economic relationships are not just defined by large corporations or national statistics, but also by everyday interactions between people, businesses, and communities. And in these regions, the connection between the United States and Canada is not abstract. It's immediate, visible, and deeply personal, which is why even small disruptions in this relationship can have effects that are both rapid and far-reaching. This situation isn't happening in isolation. Around the world, countries are reassessing their economic dependencies. There is a growing trend toward diversifying trade partners, reducing reliance on single markets, strengthening regional alliances. Canada, like many nations, has the option to expand trade relationships beyond North America. So what is the real question here? It's not just who wins, but rather, what is the long-term cost of economic tension between allies? Because in highly interconnected systems, outcomes are rarely one-sided. One important factor often highlighted in economic discussions is the composition of trade itself. A significant portion of cross-border trade includes essential goods such as energy resources, raw materials, industrial inputs. These are not easily replaceable in the short term. Trade policy is always a balancing act. Governments must weigh domestic priorities, international relationships, long-term economic stability. Decisions made in the short term can have lasting effects far beyond immediate goals. The relationship between the United States and Canada remains one of the most important economic partnerships in the world. But like any relationship, it requires balance, trust, and careful decision-making. As policies evolve, the real impact will not just be measured in headlines, but in prices, jobs, and global economic stability. And that's the part of the story that deserves the closest attention. If you want clear, fact-based breakdowns of global events without the noise, subscribe to stay informed. Because in today's world, understanding the full picture matters more than ever.